Hello, and welcome to the Dank Christian Memes podcast, Reddit talk. It's both, it's neither. We're not entirely sure what we're doing, but apparently this is what we're doing. I want to start by just letting everyone know that Dank Christian Memes is, of course, a meme subreddit, but it's also a place for a lot of discussion about religion and non-religious topics as well. And we say that Dank Christian Memes is a place for all sorts of Christians and also all sorts of non-Christians. So today we're going to be talking about ministry, Christian ministry in particular, and we are guided by our archaeologist, resident archaeologist and co-host. Jacob, how do you want to introduce yourself? I feel like you need a better title for your opening.
I guess that is a pretty accurate one at the end of the day. I'm just
resident archaeologist.
Yeah, I'm just the archaeology guy.
As if everyone has an archaeology guy.
Every friend circle has the. Yeah, that's an apt descriptor. I'll take it.
I don't know that every friend group has an archaeology guy. I'm afraid I'm the archaeology guy in my friend group, which is bad news for everyone. So there's some low-grade archaeology people out there, and we're glad to have someone high quality, well-read, and so articulate. Thanks for being here, Jacob. Void Boy, I'm glad you're here with us. Do you have a quick intro for us before I introduce our guest of honor?
Sure. Hi, it's me again. I've been showing up in a couple of these. I wouldn't say I don't have any scholarly profession. I'm a super novice when it comes to archaeology and Christianity, but I do have a deep interest, and I seem to be liked a lot, to be invited back to these things. But by profession, I'm an artist, I'm an illustrator. I do a lot of work for companies and private peoples. But yeah, it's been really fun, and I've been really enjoying these talks. Yay.
And I've heard really good things about people who you've made art for. So I think you should probably be plugging your artwork a little bit more here, especially, because you've been, I think you get the perfect attendance award.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. So our guest of honor today is Gimmicks. And I felt like, I don't want to say too much about Gimmicks, who is the ideal anon right now without even an actual profile picture. So that tells you just what kind of dangerous life Gimmicks has here. But Gimmicks, you are a member of the clergy as well. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yes. So I have been an intentional interim minister for almost 10 years now. In some denominations, interim ministry is common. I know that in some it is not common and even unheard of. But what I do is when churches just had a long pastorate, when somebody was there for 8, 10, sometimes 20 or 30 years, I will come into the congregation and I get to spend more of my time thinking about things like identity work, helping churches understand who they are now. Often it's not who they were 10 years ago. Resolving conflict. And then when they're ready, guide them through the process of searching for a new settled pastor. In the denomination I'm ordained in, the United Church of Christ, we hire and fire our own pastors. So I help churches discern when they're ready to begin that process and then walk them through it as someone who's done it many times before. I should also disclose that Broclen is a dear friend of mine. And so he turned me on to this subreddit, and I think there's actually a lot of uniqueness here. You folks are doing something over at Dank Christian Memes that is very, very rare in the world. So I commend you for that.
That's right. I just brought my friends here to sing my praises. This is really all about me at the end of the day. Gimmicks. So, you and I went to school together. And I think folks here are a little more familiar with myself and my digital ministry. What would you say are the hallmarks of a minister who's working in more traditional settings, whether, they're interim or a settled minister? What things should we expect to see in physical churches that would be different from here on Dank Christian Memes and just the internet in general?
Well, one of the biggest differences is going to be preaching. When you are in a brick and mortar church with a membership roll and a budget and things like that, one of the biggest parts of your job is having a sermon ready on Sunday morning. I would say that I spend 5 to 10 hours a week preparing sermons, and that is on the low end. Most of my colleagues spend more time than that, focusing just on the Sunday sermon. I have a couple advantages. I don't use notes when I preach, which certainly saves me some time of polishing over manuscripts. And then also, I have a new audience every couple of years. I rarely spend more than 2 years in one church before moving on to the next one, which means I get a fresh audience and I can, repeat my favorites to new folks over and over. But yeah, I would say preaching is certainly a big part of your brick and mortar traditional ministry. Also, dealing with money. Brick and mortar ministry requires a budget, and that often gets very tricky because money often gets really wrapped up with what we believe and what our ideals are and our values. And if that's what one thinks church is about. Church is about living by our values and expressing our ideals. So as a pastor, I often have to make sure I'm not getting too close to the money. I don't want to create the optics that I am imposing my will upon the church budget. But at the same time, you have a lot of conversations about money when you are a traditional brick and mortar pastor.
Yeah, on Reddit, everyone is very, very nervous about money, especially when it comes to mod teams. And we run our fundraiser during Lent for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. And one of the reasons we're able to do that is because they have such a robust system where you're not giving money to Dank Christian Memes or anyone on Reddit. You're giving money directly to St. Jude's on our little fundraiser page. Like all roads lead to them. And we never touch the money. And that's fantastic because we get to sidestep that.
I thought that was very cool. I was watching that St. Jude's fundraiser, and I want to commend you. That was pretty cool how you pulled that off.
Yeah, let's see if we can pull it off again. Let's get weird with it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have plenty of questions I could ask you, Gimmicks, and Jacob. We always touch upon interesting subjects to throw in your direction. But I want to give some folks an opportunity to come up and do Q&A. So we're going to do a little bit of back and forth because I'm sure there's folks that don't have a lot of time for us to wait and blather to ask their question. So Dank Memer, do you want to introduce yourself and ask any questions or add to the conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a Christian for for a few years now, and I don't feel like I've actually grown. I'm trying to help people, but how can I help grow my relationship with God, though?
So what you're getting at is something that I find myself having to say to people a lot. If becoming a Christian meant that all of a sudden all your problems would be solved and that everything would become easy, everyone would do it. Like, becoming a Christian would be the most common thing that anyone ever does in the history of the world. So I do think we need to get over this idea that becoming a Christian will automatically lead to just these big things going differently in your life.
Yeah, I know.
I can tell you that when I became a Christian, there was really only one way in which my life really tangibly got better. When I became a Christian, the voice in the back of my head that was always telling me, you need to impress people. You need to make sure people like you. You need to make sure that you are always putting forth the best possible image of yourself to the world. That got a lot quieter. And because I no longer felt that I was living for the approval of others, but instead living for this really indefinable something that I'm comfortable calling God, that's really probably the only way in which my life changed when I became a Christian. That being said, your classic spiritual disciplines are the things we talk about during Lent. That is your prayer, reading scripture, meditation, charitable giving, things like that. Those are going to be the most traditional answers that you would receive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also would point out that, like, you know, you should look at like where your faith currently is and question, well, what's different. I think for a lot of people, Christianity can almost become like an academic pursuit, and that can be fine and honorable. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the community. So if you're working in isolation, I think it's pretty easy to sort of run up against slowdowns if you're really trying to expand your faith perspective.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know that's not supposed to be easy. It's, from what I heard, it's very little compared to how it is. It's a lifetime on this earth. It's suffering, but then it's internal peace, though.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is what is this, like, you know, this faith that we're talking about. You know, it's a form of expression, and it manifests itself in different ways, right? For you, it's peace. For others, it's more like acceptance. You know, there is, whatever it is, there's something that attracts us to it, right? And we want to express it in a way that is genuine and that, you know, that makes sense to us. And sometimes that takes years. It takes studies. Like, you know, Broclen and Gimmicks says the same thing. It's studying, it's meditating, it's being around people. Being around people, I feel like, helps the most, because that's where you get the more perspectives and you actually start, you know, engaging with it. And it takes a long time, but it takes a long time to get there. You're asking, like, how do I be a good Christian? I mean, I think a lot of people ask themselves that, but I don't think anyone would like to say, oh, I'm the good one because I do this, you know.
That wouldn't be very humble now, would it?
Exactly. That'd be the opposite.
So I would also mention that, like, there's something to be said for, like, finding your people, right? Like, if you have a church you grew up in or a church you found, that might be great. But there might also be other groups that, you know, even if you never attended worship with them, their ideas might interest you. And, you know, you should feel comfortable with your faith being your own, that it doesn't need to necessarily look like anyone else or necessarily satisfy anyone else. But, you know, it'll be growth over time. And sometimes that growth will come easier and faster. And sometimes it may come slower or seem like it stopped altogether. But, you know, staying grounded in the here and now, I think, is often easier for folks than saying, well, the payoff at the end is going to be great, which, sure, paradise is definitely something to look forward to. But it does seem to be a long way off, doesn't it? So, you know, trying to stay grounded in the here and now experience of faith might be more helpful.
Yeah, and one more question before I have to leave. How would I try? I merely try to I try to get people to come to Christianity online. How is there a way I could help that?
Make funny memes. Make a good joke.
All right.
Gimmicks, do you want to give your response? Obviously, I think this is a place where our first answers might be a little different. What's your take?
Well, and that would be a good example of one of the things that's just different about intentional interim ministry versus the more settled pastorates. One of the reasons I got into intentional interim ministry is because evangelism is a much smaller part of the job, and that you get to spend more time working with the people who are there as opposed to the people that aren't there yet. Something that I tell people sometimes is, I don't really care much about getting non-Christians to become Christians. What I care about is getting people who claim to be Christians to act like it. So I guess I would chalk this up to a different gifts, different same spirit sort of deal. You know, I don't have a good answer as far as evangelism strategies because that's never been something I have felt called to. And actually, you are perhaps doing more of that type of work here than I do in my traditional ministry setting.
And I think that's a point of debate, which I think, you know, non-religious subs might, you know, want to weigh in and to some level. But I think that you know, if proselytization is your only goal, that's going to show, whether it's in a conversation or whether you're posting a meme. But if you want to connect with someone where they are so that you can understand them and maybe they understand you, I think that's the kind of stuff you want to look for. I doubt anyone's looked at a meme and said, oh, there's Jesus. However, I do think having a great meme that resonates with people and gives people things to discuss is where people's minds are open. So what I'm saying is the magic happens in the comments section, hopefully. And I don't think a lot of communities say that, but I think that we can say that a bit here, that we compare notes with each other and, like that theology is like nice, but also it may have led to XYZ thing. So, it's a good way to see what's out there and how other people are interacting with their faith.
As a non-minister, if I can weigh in on this for a moment, I always find that when discussing topics like religion that are often inherently kind of charged, it's often, oh, he left.
He vaporized, but I think you should still answer the question. Oh, he's back.
It's often, I think, easier to frame that discussion in a place where you're not necessarily instructing, you're just bringing discussion to the table, if that makes sense. And especially, it has to stay within the range of comfort, ultimately, because religion is a taboo subject in many parts of society. And that's just kind of how it goes. It's like politics and other things. Some people, because of their historical experiences within their life with the topic, are just going to find difficulties when someone approaches them with it. They're going to be like, oh, what are they trying to bring to me? And that can be a huge way to make sure that the conversation never actually fully happens. So I think a big part of it is make connections first, have the harder discussions later.
Yeah, I think that the priorities you bring to something are going to show, and people are going to react to that.
It wasn't that long ago that when people were choosing a church, one of the first questions they were going to ask is, what's your theology? What do you believe? That has changed very much in the era of the internet. People don't join theologies anymore. People join people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, it has to be, whatever it is has to make sense to you, and it has to be something that's genuine. Bringing in someone to Christianity, I mean, that's like, almost like, it's preaching, right? It's proselytizing. It's a very difficult, tricky thing to do, right? It's always good to just kind of keep exploring, keep looking for people. You'll find your people. You'll find those people that are ring true to you, and you'll build from that. It's always good to kind of build from community first, and then you'll keep growing. And that's how, you'll get, air quotes, bring people into Christianity, right? Oh, and he's gone.
Well, I'm sure what he heard of our answer was food for thought. But I can sympathize. I know the last couple Reddit talks I tried to join, I felt like I was being chased by a void monster that was constantly kicking me out of chats. So I sympathize with those who are similarly attacked by an internet monster that doesn't let them stay in the Reddit talks they'd prefer to be in.
And on. Do you want me to keep inviting more people up?
Yeah, if they have their hands up, I mean, we can always, if they're not polite, we can always step them down pretty easily.
I'll see if I can invite this person to speak. Let's see.
So, Gimmicks, let me ask you a question. Let's do sort of a crossover question. What do you think, based on the churches that you've interacted with in your particular cultural setting, what do you think the average, person in your pews would react to Reddit if they were exposed to it, or perhaps maybe just exposed to to some of its memes as like perhaps someone texted them to them, because I know, you know, imagining some of these people on Reddit might be a little difficult. But yeah, how do you think our particular brand of faith expression would carry in the pews of the places you've been?
So the churches that I've led, like most churches in the United States in 2022, are being kept afloat by people over 70 years old. And frequently with the technology, you're going to have a knowledge gap. So I would imagine most of the people that I've had churches with, if they logged on to our Dank Christian memes, would not really be able to understand what's going on. That being said, there have been times where I have used Dank Christian memes in my sermons as visual aids.
What?
Yes, there's at least 2 times I can think of that.
Dude, legend.
Do we have an air horn on the soundboard? This is the air horn moment. Damn, I didn't have it ready.
There is an air horn. Hold on. I can just blast it real quick.
Yeah.
Thank you.
When I talk about Jacob, then Israel wrestling with the something, God, maybe it's Esau, maybe it's an angel in the dead of night, I love to show the inscription over the Gustave Doré lithograph that says, "And lo, the angel spoke unto him, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself." And I've gotten such different reactions. I've had congregations all join with me in laughing about it. I've had congregations just not really understand what I'm showing to them.
Both of you. I mean, does this make us the ministers comedians, right? Are we the writers' room, the dark room of people, and then you guys take it out on stage and see, well, it'll play here, but in these demographics, it doesn't perform as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if I'm taking material wherever I find it, and if that's a subreddit, sweet. The other one that I've used is when I talk about the anointing at Bethany, when the woman comes in and breaks the expensive jar and anoints Jesus because she understands what's going on, even though they don't. And
controversial moment.
Yes. And a disciple, John says that it was Judas, says something like, why was this wasted? We could have sold this and given so much money to the poor. And what Jesus says something back like, look, she did what she could. She's trying to do something nice. There will always be poor people to help. Don't be mean to her. I pull up the Big Lebowski meme where he says, no, Walter, you're not wrong. You're just an asshole. That's how I interpret Jesus' response in that moment, is saying, you're not wrong. You're just, and I don't say asshole in church. I think I change it to jerk or something like that.
Well, in our church, if we had a physical church, we would have a no censorship rule. Also, probably a no one under 18 rule to go with it. So
don't bring your kids. Sorry.
Sorry, children's sermon is earlier in the morning.
I have a really interesting question. Because this is something that I've kind of been like in my back of my head. Like, do you think that there should be like an appropriate age for children to start like really digging into biblical scripture? Because some of the stuff is super heavy and like, you know, are they really understanding what's going on? Because this is like super dense stuff.
I think that's a great question. I actually did have a professor in seminary tell me the Bible is not for children. The Bible is not child appropriate. Now, I know quite a bit about the Bible. I don't know very much about children. And so I feel unqualified to answer that question, not due to lack of...
And yet so many clergy answer the question without a second thought all the time. How good of you to actually recognize that, though.
No, that being said, I think it's very odd that a lot of the stories that we usually lift up as the ones that are child-friendly, the ones that we usually see in children's Bibles, are the ones that have a lot of death in them. Noah's Ark, David and Goliath. Like, a lot of times we think of these as stories that are mainly used to talk to children about faith, and yet they're as you said, very, very heavy topics. So I don't utilize things like that in children's sermons or in confirmation classes, for example. And it's easy for me. I don't believe that the Bible is divinely inspired. I don't believe that God wrote the Bible. And so that means that...
Ooh, he went there.
No, inerrancy concept. Let's go.
Some minds may have been blown just now.
Well, but that means that I don't have a theological problem with not talking to children about the biblical stories that are extraordinarily heartbreaking violent once you understand what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, it's a collection of things, right? Because like it's it's parceling out the like the collection of stories, the collection of here's just a bunch of laws, and then all of a sudden here's an entire bloodline like ledger, and I'm like, whoa, like yeah, there has to be like selective. You got to be a little.
I don't mention this much, but I do have a daughter, so can I share a little bit about what my approach as a father has been more than a minister?
Sure. We'd love to. Sounds great.
A wild creature is attacking me. Okay. It's a cat, but it's still a wild creature. So my daughter is 8 years old. And I think that, questions of at what age do you expose kids to certain things is really going to depend on the kid a lot. And it's going to depend on their development, and then also around, well, did they grow up in a church environment or not? I think that for me, I'm a big fan of looking at the Bible as a library. There are plenty of stories and things to take out of there, but not all of them all the time. We did do Noah's Ark. So, we did cover that when she was younger. We had a couple of pretty solid little story books of it. And, you can actually buy a stuffed ark full of, two of a bunch of animals. So she got that from her godfather at one point. So, there are all these like little tools that like, if you want these stories to be part of their understanding, you can do that. And there are plenty of people who want to sell you a watered down option. So it's more family friendly for, their first interaction with it.
VeggieTales Esther story is the one that springs to mind there.
Right.
Where like it's so sanitized that if you're aware of the original story, it's sometimes funny at times, but it's still like, it still works as a Bible story in some way.
I love Rugrats. My daughter enjoys Rugrats, and they're very good, but they're also very careful in their tellings of some of the Jewish stories. But I'll say, for me, I focus on Jesus a lot. Like what I want my daughter to come away with is not necessarily a deep and intricate understanding of both the Old and New Testament. I want her to understand who the person of Jesus is. So when she's out in the world seeing people say, Jesus says X, Y, Z, she has some experience understanding. So, I try to read with her every Sunday if I can. It doesn't always work out that way. And I try to just like focus on a story, whether it's like a parable, I think that she could handle. Like, I think the widow's mite is a relatively easy one. Or, the Lord's Prayer, just finding, I use my gospel parallels, and it's not the gospels and find a story and sometimes start reading on one and finish reading on another books. So that's been really good, but I'm, being very deliberate and very choosy. We're still in an Easter Bunny paradigm. We are not in a crucifixion, so like it's there, it's mentioned, but that's not the focus at this point. So we're going to get there.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of crucifixions, I was having a discussion with my friend about like, what actually kills you in a crucifixion, and is actually suffocation is the most common thing.
Oh yeah, I mean it's possible to die of something first, but usually I think that's what did.
Mm-hmm. That's what does it to you, because of the method that was used at the time during the first century. You would kind of like your arms splayed out, and as the victim would just get tired, they would kind of lean forward because their arms will give out, and staying in that position for a long time would cause you to like have difficulty breathing. So like that would be like common cause of like passing out and suffocating and dying.
Yeah,
On
there's
top of
been
that,
some
you have to-
discussion on the sub about just how kind of crazy it is that Christianity, at least in this time period, uses the cross as its primary symbol, and it's sort of a morbid thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that, my understanding, and there's people qualified to speak on this era. My understanding is that was not the case until approximately the era of Constantine, because Constantine ended the practice of crucifying criminals. Crucifixion was supposed to be this not just gruesome but humiliating death. It was supposed to be something that made an example of you. And up until Constantine, the Roman Empire was still crucifying people. So no one was using the cross as a symbol of Christianity. It was only after Constantine ended that practice that the cross became associated with Jesus specifically, as opposed to this practice they were still seeing around.
That's
Jacob,
interesting.
do we know what the pre-Constantine symbols commonly were? Was it the alpha fish like we have on the back of our cars now?
So it's early Christian art is an interesting thing because we don't actually have that much of it.
We have the horse meme though, and that's
The
very
horses.
Oh yeah, there's the graffito that's mocking Jesus.
Yeah, the Alexamenos graffito. I show
Yeah.
that to every church I go to.
important. Yes.
That's a spicy one to show in church. But no, so early Christianity was fairly diverse and mostly aniconic when we look at it archaeologically. Like most Christians just kind of met in their houses. And so it takes until I think the 2nd century that you start seeing church buildings. There's the one in, I think it's Dura Europos is the earliest known church site, where we have one archaeologically. And there it's decorated with largely just various stories from the Old and New Testament, because the symbols for Christianity took time to develop and largely developed to the state church, especially because there weren't overarching symbols for like the other religions of the Roman Empire. That's kind of a new concept.
So it took a while before we got marketing people in Christianity to really work on the branding sort of stuff.
Yeah, took some definition, some.
Well, and when you have a
Design
state that is, has an interest in certain narratives reaching the public, that's a nifty apparatus. And another example of how, Christianity under Constantine became a religion of rule and narrative and marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You could argue. Mm-hmm.
Even Constantine, there's a lot of like public misunderstanding of the changes Constantine made. Like he did not actually make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Rather, he gave it.
Didn't he decriminalize it?
Yes.
So the criminalization of Christianity is a very complex topic. It was never consistently banned between Nero and Constantine, like you often hear. Rather, there were periodic incidences of persecution that were usually regional. And so what Constantine did is essentially it didn't have the same legal status as a lot of other religions in the Roman Empire. And so he just put it on the same standing as the state religion. And then it was in the reign of Theodosius I that it became the official religion, the sole official religion, and the crackdown on paganism began and other things.
Mm-hmm. Also, like one could argue that the Cairo could be like a really early, like another way of like Christian art.
But don't you have to be like literate to understand the Cairo? Or is that something that like a lot of people weren't literate in these time periods. So like now we would assume that every Christian is literate, but that especially when we're talking about a variety of languages, might not be so.
Well, like we know what the Hindu Om symbol looks like, whether or not we read Sanskrit. So I think it can work even if you don't.
Oh, you got me there.
It could, because it was more of a. I mean, the Cairo when it was created, if you looking back at it, it was more of a publicity stunt, right? It was more of a legitimizing Constantine as a great leader because God is on his side and the Christian population was growing, and it was good for, maintaining peace in times of instability, right? And I think creating symbols like that to tell people, I'm one of the good guys, or I'm, you should follow me. I think it was a good strategy on my end. I mean, I guess I'm not sure how it would be distributed, right? Because if you look at early Christian art, a lot of it is in catacombs, in literal caves, right? And so how would that, be publicly displayed? It's probably not super prominent, but it's would definitely been used in places, right? I'm really scared now that everyone's got real quiet.
Yeah, I mean, you see it around from an early date, but I don't know exactly when. So I don't know when to answer when it becomes common.
I'm having a dyslexic moment. I can't read your name in Insatiate. Should I read it like Latin?
It's a Roman reference. It's Caligula's horse.
Oh my God! I took Latin.
Correct.
This is how bad I am. It's been a long time.
Oh my God! Never read Latin.
Introduce yourself, and if you have a question, shoot your shot.
Yeah, I have a question about the symbolism of the cross. I'm wondering if it was put there by some institution, or if it just developed as the symbol for Christianity because it was so prevalent in depictions in churches.
I think that it probably developed kind of naturally from usage by multiple communities. Because, ultimately, when it comes down to symbols and whatnot, what ends up happening tends to be that people use and reuse symbols on a local level until they begin to take on meaning and recognition. So I think it was there are many times when the Roman state meddled in Christianity. I don't particularly think the use of the cross was one of those. I think that was a fairly to use an imprecise but I guess relevant term, a fairly democratic development on the part of usage over time.
Just sort of a matter of what people picked up and used more than something someone was pushing necessarily.
Right. Yeah, because images of the cross itself, it slowly starts to creep up around the 4th century, and then really starts ramming up once we go into early medieval era into 6th century. That's where it's getting depicted in churches and it's getting actually painted in. And yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of naturally starts sprunging up because this is a time where people are very illiterate right now, and symbols are super important to communicate things. And the very complex, story of a Jesus and his sacrifice, it's somehow it's easier just to kind of compact that into a really simple symbol that, you immediately understand what it means once you see it. Right.
You know what this means, right?
What?
That any meme could be the next. There's no rule that the cross has to be the symbol. If you get the right meme on the right subject, I imagine preferably single frame, that you could have a defining symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Our picture of the Jesus statue doing the finger guns kind of is
finger guns
for this in this community at least.
I love Buddy Christ from Dogma. One day we'll do a Dogma movie night.
But yeah, it's super complex. I mean, I took a lot of Christian art history back in school, and there was more focus on having figures. If you're looking at like Byzantine art, right? It was mainly focused on like having figures with circular patterns and like a lot of gold leaf, a lot of flat stuff, flat images. And I'm not sure like when the cross really became like in vogue. Like I'm shooting in the dark, but it's probably like up until when like Catholicism started, gaining more prominence, where the cross started being used more as like a solid symbol of like of a group of people. Because back then, like it's so different, right? Because looking at it how it was back then, like in the early century, is so different than what it is like in the 6th or in the 16th century. Pretty wacky, but yeah, it's memes. It's all memes.
That's how we're going to sell it anyway. That's our spin. It's always been memes. You all are just realizing it now.
That is the premise of meme theory, to do the weird thing and cite Richard Dawkins in a Dank Christian memes chat. He is the one who originated the term meme as we use it today, which is like a passed down unit of culture.
A portable idea.
Gets selected for or against.
Well, and Reddit seems to be like in sort of a purist form how, these things are tested against each other, where like there's less of a sort of competitive spirit on Facebook and a different kind of competitive spirit on Twitter. Did we answer the question? Did you have any follow-ups?
Right now, my questions are answered. Thank you. Interesting.
Wow, nice. So I have a question for you, Gimmicks. I will admit I've made a few memes in my time that sometimes folks on the internet, on Dank Christian memes, we poke fun at the decline of the church and church membership. In your experience, do people at your churches tend to be aware that church is declining? And if so, do they see this as a problem to be solved, or just something to be sort of rode out?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was probably one of my biggest adjustments from my seminary education to the actual practice of ministry. So in seminary, the decline of organized religion was always the elephant in the room. It was always part of every conversation. It was part of the lens through which we viewed every topic. It was such a given. And then I got out into churches and found that no one there was really talking about it, that it wasn't just this given that everyone was aware of and just the landscape beneath our feet. So as an intentional interim, one of the things that I often need to do is get churches talking about this, saying, look, the demographic trends, statistical trends are overwhelming. Huge numbers of churches, even if they're doing everything right, are going to close in the next 10 to 20 years. And it's not personal. It's bigger than our individual choices. And yet,
do people feel like it's personal?
Yes. A lot of people think that if your church closes, or even if you acknowledge that your church might close someday, that this somehow reflects a lack of faith or a lack of character on your own part. And I frequently have to push back against that and say, look, like I said before, this is bigger than our individual choices. This is a huge thing that is happening on a much higher scale than our individual church. And so it does not reflect a lack of faith, and it does not reflect a lack of character if you engage in discussion about the fact that your church might and will close someday. So
that's hard truth. I imagine people are really, really struggle with hearing that.
They do. Yeah, a lot of people really, really aren't ready to hear that, and certainly aren't ready to say it first. And so I often need to be the person who says it first. And when churches do talk like that, it gives them the opportunity to see the end of their church's story go in a more planned way, as opposed to just it happening to them. The churches that are bitter enders, the ones that say, no, things are going to turn around, have faith. A lot of times those are the ones that when it's time to close, there's no money left to give to charity. And, people have just kind of been angry and frazzled and don't have any energy left because they've been scrambling for the last several years. Whereas when churches see it coming, when churches are like, okay, this is our most likely future. How do we want to do this? What do we want our legacy to be? Or maybe even if they see it coming, they're able to swing a merger and merge with another church. That just strikes me as so much more graceful than refusing to talk about decline because you're worried that it's personal and just wasting a lot of energy letting a church slowly crumble beneath your feet.
Yeah, I think that adds a lot of context to what my experience has been, because I've always been focused. I had a lot of friends who left the church around the time of confirmation, and that really struck me. So I've always had a focus on church decline, and I would get what I saw as a real lack of optimism or a lack of hope. But when you take it so personal that it's so hard to talk. Well, how? Of course, we couldn't get to hope because we're just not ready to come to grips with that reality. So that's kind of a bummer. Do you see anyone who wants to try new things other than weird people on the internet like us, or is it really just all about that local parish and whether or not your family legacy stays with it?
Yeah. So in the United Church of Christ, our national setting is doing a very big push for what is called Church 3.0. And Church 3.0 is about ministry settings that don't utilize buildings or paid staff. Some Church 3.0...
Hey, that's us.
Yes. Yeah. Sounds a lot like what you're doing here. Because one of the things that we do know is that even in our generation where fewer people are going to church, a lot of them do see a lot of hypocrisy of money in church. And so a budget-free church or a church where every single dollar you put in the plate goes to charity is seen as being more appealing. But I have to say that I'm not convinced that we're simply going to have this smooth transition to Church 3.0 and Christianity will just continue in the same vein, except this one thing is different. I mean, I've been hearing a lot of this. 10 years ago, we were being told that flying our inclusiveness flag high was going to bring young people back to the church. 5 years ago, we were being told that changing our music habits was going to bring young people back to the church. A couple of years ago, embracing technology, young people back to the church. I don't think any of that really gets to the problem. I think that young people can go anywhere in our society to express their values. Like a lot of the things that Jesus said that were radical have become mainstream now. Ideas like forgiveness and generosity are things that you do for yourself as much as for others, that they have value in and of themselves as opposed to the goodwill they garner. The idea of love being the center of our moral philosophy, the being of service to others as being an act of praise towards God. Like these ideas have become mainstream. You don't need to go to church to find people who live these values anymore. And so I think the problem is that increasingly people are associating Christianity with supernaturalism. And
definitely on Reddit, I've seen that.
And none of these things, modernizing the music, lowering the budget, going online, none of these things are really addressing that. And I don't see the decline in organized religion changing until someone tackles that problem. I shouldn't say problem. Someone tackles that tension.
That is super, super fascinating. Thank you so much for saying that, because I do agree that the closing of churches is not the same as people being less spiritual or less inclined to, take Christianity. I feel a lot of people still want to believe, and they want to find a practice that makes sense to them. They just haven't been finding it in the traditional avenues. And I think this is going to happen. Yeah.
I think that there's also, I want to talk about the deconstruction movement, which is something that grew out of evangelicalism, but I don't think it's exclusive to that. But
Ooh, hang on, before you switch topics, could someone just clarify how, if you don't think that the church is about the supernatural, what is it about then?
memes, giving to charity, community, self-betterment. I think we, especially on Dank Christian memes, I think a lot of people, when they come into Christianity, whether they're born into it or whether they join later on, that they grab a whole package of ideas that their denomination has given to them. And I think in reality, people want to be able to pick and choose from these ideas, but not necessarily have all of them. So I'm going to throw it to Gimmicks so he can say something more intelligent.
I think that the way you asked that question is exactly the tension that I'm talking about. None of the attempts at reconciling the worldview that most young people have today are able to answer the question you just asked. I think in part because there's so many other places in society young people can go to see love valued, to see generosity and forgiveness and grace valued. Increasingly, when people look at church, they specifically are only associating it with, a place claiming to have bold answers to life's big questions and delving into the mysteries of the universe, which often is, what I do think is supernaturalism. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think the way you asked your question gets exactly to the tension that I'm talking about. The reason young people are staying away from church, I don't not think it's because of the music or these things that people think it's about. It's because increasingly they associate religion with the forms of belief in the supernatural that in our society are not mainstream.
I'm also we were talking about marketing earlier. It's a corrupt brand. It's not, the bad news stories far outweigh the good news stories. And a lot of the things people, especially young people, are reluctant about in society is embodied in how people see the big C church, not any denomination, but Christianity overall. And I think that, there's a lot of churches that are like, oh, well, not us. We didn't do this. And I think that those churches haven't been willing to well, you have to own that somebody did. If someone in the body of Christ did something wrong, then surely you as the rest of the body of Christ must do something good to bring balance, if not to make it better. And I don't think that this is a place where a lot of churches are going. And so the brand remains corrupted. I also think it's worth noting that, conservative folks and churches do tend to have more money around these things, but it's not fair to blame any one faction for what is a almost universal decline.
I thought that the Muslim religion wasn't in decline versus at least, Christianity and the other.
Oh, we're just talking about Christianity. I would have no reason to believe. I don't even know about the numbers of other religions. I'm pretty clueless there.
You don't think that it would be important to see if there's another religion that's able to gain traction, that perhaps Christianity could learn something about how they're surviving in the modern world?
Oh, absolutely. But I also think that, we've had some folks from Islam on the show that, can better represent their culture. And I think that, there are
a lot of great examples to be seen. I think that, and you make a good point that Christians tend to see this as an in-house problem. So maybe, looking at other, the notes of other religions might be helpful as well. But, Christianity is a little self-obsessed. I can admit to that.
And one of the really weird things that's happening, at least in the West, is that the flavors of Christianity that are declining more slowly are the ones that are pushing themselves to the extremes. The ones that either fly their liberal or their conservative flag high. We live in a time when people increasingly see that as their primary self-identifier. When people think about their personal identity, increasing the very first thing people associate themselves as is either liberal or conservative. And one of the things that's happening is it's incentivizing churches to either be the most conservative church in town or the most liberal church in town. And
that's polarization.
It is, and it's adding to it. It's just making the polarization problems we're having worse. And people are getting sucked into it because it seems to be what's going to work in the short term. And actually, the statistics even do say that it's what's the best in the short term if you measure success by membership. But is that really setting us up for long-term success? I don't feel great about it.
If I may sort of jump in, so if you maybe I'll tell my accent, and sorry if my internet cuts out a lot, but I'm from the UK, so and I think when we talk about Western Christianity, at least when you guys do, I get the sense that it's very much just US Christianity. The UK is about 30 years ahead, I'd say, of the US in terms and I think what we see here is actually really interesting. Progressive Christianity is really small. Ultimately, it's, I guess, yeah, I won't say too much because I don't want to be biased, but and it's actually I don't want to call it fundamentalist because I think that means something very different for US Christians, but it's the more conservative churches now that are actually growing. And I think that just to bring a more worldwide perspective as well, I mean, Christianity all around the world, ultimately, children are born.
Yeah, it's growing everywhere.
Yeah. Ultimately, children are being born into Christian families. And last time I saw statistics, Christianity actually scores, well, I should say scores, but Christianity grows the most through conversion out of the world religions. Islam is faster growing, but that's just because of the insane. That's just what population statistics tell us. I think going back to the UK church, which again is quite far ahead of the US church, I can tell you that there really isn't much of a reason to worry. The church here is it's refined, there's so much more pressure on the church, but as we see in places like China or pressure on the church, it seems to refine it in a way, make it more effective, make it more focused on the gospel. Because we don't really experience much cultural Christianity anymore in the UK. Obviously, there are still old people who are like, oh yeah, I'm Anglican, I'm I'm white British, so therefore I'm Christian or whatever. But now, for my generation, cultural Christianity is so small that anyone who is calling themselves a Christian generally has, biblical intentions, ideas, and therefore I think it'd be wrong to say that Christianity has gone downhill. I think it's actually just gotten more honest, to to be fair. That's just kind of, I guess, a UK perspective, or my UK perspective. I'm sure someone else would say something completely different. But.
Can I ask, in the UK, are churches, or at least some churches, part of the government?
So where you might be getting that idea from is that we do have now the Church of England is, I think, still officially the state religion, maybe, but there's no government involvement within the Church of England, but there is some involvement within the government from the Church of England. So our higher level of Parliament, which is called the House of Lords, if you're one of the highest ranking Church of England bishops, so like Bishop of York, and the big one is Bishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, you are automatically given a seat within that upper level of Parliament. And with the Queen being currently, I mean, her children aren't faithful, but with the current Queen being that church, technically the head of the Church of England, aside from Christ, and also she's the head of state. So there is a little bit of interchange, but
no king but Christ. But no one said anything about a queen.
Pardon?
No, there's a common phrase, no king but Christ, but you guys have a queen, so it's still, you still get around it.
Yeah, I think it's like she's the earthly head of the Church of England, in the same way as the head of the Catholic Church, right? It's relatively similar to that. I spent quite a bit of time in the Church of England when I was younger, so I know it quite well.
Vermilion, you want to introduce yourself and either share a question or a perspective you have?
Well, yeah, I'd like to do both. I'd like to add on to what Ultimate was saying, because I'm here in East Texas, and I'm 19, so I know what the youth is like. And here there's a very strong component of cultural Christianity, which I didn't have because I'm from a different part of Texas, and I was raised in an atheist household, so I'm a convert. And it's very interesting to see how strong the idea of Christianity is here, where there's so many people who say, yeah, I'm Christian. They'll wear a cross on their neck. They'll do all that stuff. They never go to church. And if you ask them, they don't believe in God. And if you ask them again, they don't believe in Jesus at all, but they're Christian. And so what I'm seeing here is I see a lot of, it's an interesting thing of decline in Christianity and growth, where there's a huge decline in the number of people who are, how should I put it, in faith overall, but the hardcore church who is very intent on reading the scripture is growing significantly here as well amongst the youth. But like you said, Ultimate, it's just everybody who is very serious about it, but there's also that cultural aspect as well.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
What I'll often say is that, like, in the UK, generally being openly Christian isn't worth the hassle unless you actually are Christian. Right? It's like someone my age saying, "Oh yeah, I'm Christian, I'm this or that and that," relationship with Jesus. Right? They're just inviting themselves to get, some flack, some jokes, whatever, and like people going like,
well, let's not stand in judgment of other people's faith. That's not really what we're here to do.
Yeah, I don't think I was judging anyone. I think, having a relationship with Jesus is a fairly standard idea. But say like you get those people coming to you asking, "Oh, what do you think about abortion, LGBT stuff? Women in leadership." I think it just wear people down.
Turtle Smurf, do you want to introduce yourself, ask a question?
Hey, how's it going? I just got in here recently. I thought it was awesome that you guys were hosting a room. But I kind of just wanted to hear where you guys were taking the conversation first before I decided to jump in. But I knew that I would want to speak at some point. would you like me to ask something now, or is that okay if I just kind of wait until I think of something a little more, in tune with what you guys have going on?
Oh, well, we're kind of all over the place. So, I mean, if you want to ask now, that's fine. But I don't want to put you in a corner or anything.
Well, what were you guys talking about leading up to this, if you don't mind me asking?
We were just sort of comparing our cultural experiences of Christianity. While it may be, what they call mainstream Christianity in the United States is on the decline. Yeah. Christianity globally is not. UK Christianity had declined. More than it is in the United States, but there's some reports that some of those numbers are starting to come back up. So we were just kind of sharing regional perspectives, but I think it would be good for a question to sort of tie us down to our original format.
Okay. Let me give it a shot then. So I am I was born in the buckle of the Bible Belt, as they like to call themselves. I'm sure a lot of places in the South like to call themselves that, but Charlotte, North Carolina. And so we've got a good mix of kind of that Billy Graham evangelical crowd with the kind of mountain charismatics of the Appalachia and everything off of 85 that kind of runs in those areas. We've got a big Catholic population. There's a lot of Hispanic. There's a lot of different representations of faith in this area. But I guess I don't know if this is much of a question as a kind of my own view of it, but I would say that as far as numbers and declining, the initial conventions are starting to fail, I'd say. However, I'd say the concept of individualizing your faith in a personal relationship with Christ that's not as overseen as some of the denominations would have liked to.
Decentralized, maybe?
Yeah, I would say that the faith is becoming more decentralized.
You're wrong.
The Chinese kind of method of cell churches is proving very successful in a lot of ways. And I think that what this English or British gentleman said, where it's kind of like it's becoming harder to be a Christian in public unless you actually are one. I feel like that's a great description of the idea that you should expect, kind of a bit of criticisms if you're going to say that you stand up for something, and that it's really only going to be worth it if you can actually defend your faith in the long run in modern society. However, I think that you guys also made a good point that sometimes that can look like it's standing in judgment of Christians at the same time when you're starting to, what's the phrase, deconstructing is what people are using now, and kind of figuring out where their faith is. So I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts. I don't know where to start, but.
Yeah, we talked about deconstruction comes up now and again. And one thing I like to say about it is, like, it is what you make of it, right? Some people are just going to deconstruct parts of their faith because, they have questions or it's not working for them, or maybe they need to do more reading or studying on it. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that you disconnect all the pieces and you have all the individual Lego pieces of you on the floor. But even in cases where you do that, I think what's more important, I think a lot of people are aghast at what gets taken apart, but how you put it back together and what you choose to make of it after that deconstruction is equally important. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily have the energy to get there because they're going through a lot in that process. But I like to, remind folks that, it can be broken down and it can be rebuilt, and that can be a positive thing for faith or experience of divinity.
I mean, I'd almost call that a mandatory aspect of our faith is self-criticism and meditation and analyzing where you are. I mean, we wouldn't have examples like Peter to follow it, in my mind, if we didn't look at things like that, where it's like, for me, deconstruction is, seeing the parts of your faith that are unsuccessful in a sense. And obviously that term is very loaded when you look at success. I'm sure Joel Osteen would have a different definition as,
oh boy.
But exactly. But for me, it's like when I look at deconstruction, it's about, is what I'm doing a exercise of futility, like Peter would, constantly go on and be reprimanded for or rebuked by Christ? Or is this, are you breaking something that's already broken and replacing it with something new in the same spirit? Or are you just destroying everything that makes you feel insecure? And I think a lot of people have a hard time dealing with that, like whether it's, dealing with LGBTQ issues or dealing with sexism in the church. I think people often throw the baby out with the bathwater instead of refining their faith. I guess maybe that's what I mean, is taking out some of the impurities and getting to a more pure format of your belief system is how I view deconstruction, as opposed to just figuring out why you disagree with things.
Well, and I think what I was alluding to, and I'm going to pass it to you, Gimmicks, in a minute. We see this on Dank Christian memes quite a bit. We see atheists come in like as hard anti-theists, and if they say the wrong thing, they will get banned. And then come out later saying, I'm not there. I'm not a Christian, but I understand a lot better, and I'm not as angry as I was. And likewise, we have Christians who are, very dedicated to their theology and their traditions say, you know what, I'm still dedicated to that, but I can appreciate jokes and this sort of shared space that we have at Dank Christian memes.
Right.
And in between all that, I have seen people who are raised in one kind of Christianity tell stories about how, they really deconstructed it a lot and then put it back together, and it turned out they were a Christian still. Or that, atheism was a place where they spent a time, and for some people that is where they're going to end up, and that's that, they may not go back from there. But like that there are folks that stop off on atheism and need to spend time there before they can come back to faith. And when they do, having been on that other side of the fence, I've heard people say that, yeah, that's actually was sort of a benefit in the long run. So Gimmicks, I want to ask you, deconstruction is out there. It's something people talk about. I think for the most part, people speak about it pretty poorly inside of Christianity. So I'm trying to give some nuance to that. Do, the folks you've known in your pews, do they understand what deconstruction is, or do they operate off a different term? And if so, is it a big bad thing, or is it a tool for spiritual development?
So I was in a church one time where we shared space with a congregation for whom deconstruction was what they were doing. It was their identity. So that they were a much smaller congregation, much newer one, much younger one. But we allowed them to use our chapel on Sundays, and then we shared fellowship time, and we shared Sunday school, which was an enormous help because they had way more kids than we did. But that was what they were doing, and they would frequently use the word reconcile. This was a congregation that had, all of these individuals had grown up in very strict evangelical homes, and many of them had negative experiences or even traumas around some of the things that happened in these homes. And so what they were doing in this congregation is they were reconciling the faith that they still had with these experiences. They were talking through their experiences in a way to try to make these things fit together and reconcile. And from my understanding, it actually was a very positive experience. Everyone who went to that congregation spoke very highly of it. When our congregants would visit that congregation, they also spoke highly of the experience. It certainly sounds as though it was a very honest and real process and vulnerable process that they were going through together. Now, that being said, it was certainly a dynamic in that congregation that a certain percentage of their members were going to either deconstruct their faith until there was nothing left, or deconstruct their faith, put it back together, and now they have this nice, neat little package, and they know what they believe, and now they don't have to go to church anymore. And people would drift away.
Oh boy!
This journey had reached a conclusion, and now they could just put their faith on the shelf and go home.
Oh wow. Well,
Can I
you a
ask
question
what
about that?
you? Excuse me, Turtle Smurf, if you want to
Yeah,
go.
go
I'm
ahead,
kind
buddy.
of interrupting. Okay, thanks. I wanted to ask you what you meant by deconstruction, because do you mean deconstruction as in testing what your preconceived notions are against Scripture, or do you mean deconstruction as try to make all of these conflicting ideas in your head fit, or both? I mean, I just
Both.
for some clarity
It's
Yeah.
kind
on
of
how
become a
they
buzzword.
Well,
okay.
and for a lot of the people in this Congress, and this is a small group that I'm talking about, I'm sure there are very different experiences than just the small group of people that I happen to get close to and get to know well. But yes, testing the things that they had been taught as children against Scripture, learning what things that they had been taught as children wasn't actually biblical. It was just the culture of their local church in a way that they, as impressionable children, came to believe was biblical, but also testing it against other ways of knowing, like their lived experiences and history and scholarship and things like that. But yeah, I would say that was a big part of what they were doing. What parts of my belief structure are actually come from, what sources do they come from? Which ones of them come from Scripture? Which ones of them come from just local church culture that was lifted up as if it was gospel?
Okay, so
Yeah, and someone
deconstruction is
talked
definition.
about purifying their faith, and that can mean a lot of different things. But I have observed, and again, this is what I see from the Dank Christian memes perspective. So this is, this doesn't apply to anything other than our weird little community. Is that folks are, deconstructing as they're moving as they're becoming post-denominational. I think that there are
Right.
a lot of Christian folks on the internet that have sort of come to understand that they've received a flavor of Christianity from either the tradition they were born into or the tradition they converted into. And I think folks get a bad taste in their mouth from their original flavor after a while. There can be all number of legitimate reasons. So I think they want to pursue a post-denominational view. And like Gimmicks was saying, that they want to settle the issues of faith and be done with it, sort of like that. It's
Right.
not necessarily the same. And there's all sorts of different motivations, and people, end up in all sorts of different places. But yeah, I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, and let me throw this in there as well. I think that depending on a person's interaction, that is true. Like if you grow up in a specific denomination and you have some issues with some of the dogma that gets thrown around or your local church's culture, I think that one thing that is understated is that I think that the reason this is happening is because of the lack of ability for criticisms of a denomination to make its way up the chain. So when you view yourselves as someone whose belief set may not actually be from the Bible, once you start to take your own, what you believe to be responsibility of your own faith instead of listening, taking it from the pew on a Sunday, there's some people who take that responsibility and run too far where they think they know everything just because they figured out they can read the Bible themselves. And then there's some people, so I think that slingshot effect or that whiplash is real. But I think
and people move
there
through
is a
those
real,
places in earnest. I think a lot of people
right,
see someone
exactly.
move through atheism, they're like, oh, they fell off the wagon. They were always a lukewarm Christian. They were never saved. And I think that that's incredibly unfair, especially considering that turns out to just be one brief stop off in a much larger and more nuanced story. I have a few housekeeping things. I have a comment question we should get to, but before that, Giraffe Comic has been waiting. Giraffe Comic, you want to introduce yourself and throw a question out if you have one?
Yeah, for sure. So my question kind of has come from like we were talking about before with the like the whole decline in church, and we were kind of talking about the whole time, but like so I'm part of a college ministry, for example. I'm not like in college anymore, but I'm still part of the ministry, like helping kind of the next generation of like college students. And like, why is there like more emphasis on like these large churches that have declining populations to like, if not like have a college ministry to like support college ministries? You think? Because I think that's like a really good area to actually see evangelism like take place, see people actually get saved. Because I mean, that's like a lot of the, I guess, like fastest growing churches in America are college ministries right now. So
It's actually been my experience that denominations invest very heavily in college ministries. And again, I have a very limited experience. There's a lot more people.
Oh, I have a story after this. Remind me about
I would
churches
agree
in
with
college.
Gimmicks. I would agree with you, Gimmicks, in my experience.
And what I see a lot of in my area is that denominations will actually subsidize a church if it is close to a college campus. If it is within walking distance of the dorms of a major university, the denomination will actually directly fund that church so that it can keep the doors open, even though its parish is largely going to be people who don't put much in the plate because they have a negative value or negative net worth. So I actually see a lot of that. I've been in a couple colleges or a couple of churches that were near colleges, and there was huge, big steeple churches in the area that were intentionally put there by the denomination in order to give the college students the option of walking in the door.
Oh, I have a story of some. So here, let me just a tale of two denominations. So my denomination, the United Church of Christ, did not invest very heavily. They had at the state college I attended, they had a single part-time, I don't even know if she was paid, minister on campus. And she was doing some good work, but she was part-time. Meanwhile, any group of students could come together, and if they followed the right rules, they could get a club. And if they followed the right rules, they could get that club funded through the student government. And we had ministers of churches basically trying to establish their church as a club and really trying to walk a line with, separation of church and state and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So there were, in fact, Christian groups on campus that had a full club and the backing of a church, but not all of them were successful. And I think that this is something that a lot of people look at a state college and say, no, there's too many obstacles. And these folks got creative, man. And I got to wonder if some of the students in question signed up to go to the state college specifically to make this happen, because you have to have, a certain number of students to legitimize the organization. So yeah, I believe 100% that folks are trying real hard, but whether or not they have money and resources is a big question, depending on where you're at.
So in my area, some business leaders have actually put together a ton of money to start investing in both, I believe, high school and college churches and like those area of ministry. So one of my best friends, actually, his full-time position is just traveling around the country and establishing funding and like support for churches who are trying to get started in those areas of college or high school. So there's millions getting poured into those.
Oh, we cut out.
Giraffe comic, were you going to say something?
No, I was just gonna say because the ministry I'm part of is like totally independent from like any major church. It's like we are like our ministry is college students, and I think like 80% of our money comes from outside of our church, actually, from like.
Would you mind telling us who it is?
Individual. Yeah, it's called Hope Church Movement. It's like a college ministry in the Southwest.
Throw a link in the comments if you like.
Yeah, I can. It's just like interesting because like I feel like when you look at like statistics and all that, like you see like most people, if you're not like a Christian by 25, typically you don't become a Christian after that point. Obviously, like God can work miracles and all that, but it's just like not, you don't see like the big push of the next generation a lot of times with these older churches. And I feel like a lot of the money is kind of going towards things that are like less, I guess, less profitable to the kingdom in the sense of like, you know, they might go like to overseas missions when we're like losing the battle here in America, or money might be going towards different ministries like that typically don't have, I wouldn't say don't have impact. Like they help like homeless people, they help like, you know, hurricane ravaged nations, but I don't know. That's like where I'm at. Like people like complain about churches declining, but it's like, well, who are you helping or what are you doing to help, kind of.
And who's responsible?
So, Gimmicks, what do you see in your community? Like, do people seem to value good works and sort of, you know, bearing fruit as a community? Do they see that as a viable road to expansion, or at least maybe repairing the damaged brand of Christianity? To what extent are works a priority amongst the people you've ministered to?
I think it's going up. I think the trend is that works are more often seen as how to measure success. So I do think that there's an institutional bias that I think it's very easy for people to get caught up in measuring success by things like attendance and membership and giving. And there's good reasons for that. I mean, those are easily measurable, and you know they probably do have a lot of correlation with whether your church will still be open in 10 or 20 years. But as churches increasingly get frustrated with not seeing success, if you measure success by those metrics, more and more churches, I do think, are asking the question of, well, what is our value to the community? Like, what would the community lose if we did close? And a lot of times, even though it's shifting your focus away from evangelism and towards service, it might actually be better evangelism, because you will oftentimes get more positive attention from for people seeing you and saying, oh, wow, they really believe what they're talking about. Look at what they're doing, like the sacrificial love they're showing to the community. They must really be affected by what they're doing on Sundays. Oftentimes that is actually better evangelism than talking about religion right away. So I do think that there are a lot of churches that are increasingly measuring success by the ways they're able to give back to the community instead of attendance, membership, and giving.
All right, I need to jump in here with a little bit of house cleaning. I'm going to be removing some of you from the stage so I can cycle more people in. Don't take it personal, and if you want to talk more, just raise your hand again, and I will most likely let you on stage in time, but I'm trying to keep the group manageable here. So we do have a question in the comments, and I am duty bound to represent the comments, or I will be chastised, and rightfully so. So someone has the question: what are your thoughts on the Dead Sea Scrolls and interpretation of the text? They note John Allegro. I don't think I'm familiar with them. How do you view and distinguish the identity of ancient Christian Orthodox in comparison to today's ideology? Well, there's a lot of question right there, and I haven't even read the whole thing. Gimmicks, do you want to speak to the Dead Sea Scrolls, or maybe what people think of the Dead Sea Scrolls in your communities?
Sure. Yeah, and this might also be a good question for a resident archaeologist as well. But I will say that most people in the churches that I have led are aware of the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they don't know much about what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I attribute this to the fact that when they were discovered, it was a really when they were discovered, it kind of made these very splashy headlines. And I think that people expected game-changing stuff out of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think people expected to read texts that were going to turn Christianity on its head. And since that didn't really happen, the legs of the story kind of fizzled out. I know that when I read the Dead Sea Scrolls, I was surprised at how, in a lot of ways, it just kind of sounded like the Bible. But I suppose some people do take that as evidence that the Bible as we have it now is closer to what the Essene Church had than perhaps we could have taken it for granted before. However, I think that for me personally, probably one of the most impactful items of the Dead Sea Scrolls is increasing evidence that Jesus would have seen himself as an Essene and perhaps even a follower of John the Baptist.
I'm also going to throw in another cultural note. I've read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and like you said, they're similar, but so is all other religious writing from this time period and location. But if you like anime, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a major inspiration for Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I think this is one of the big misunderstandings about the show is folks think the show is based off the Bible, where it's actually based off the Dead Sea Scrolls and the conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And big theme is we don't know which side humans are. Are humans the good guys or bad guys in Evangelion? That's a big part of it. So on that note, which is
the war
I want to. Yes, the war scroll. And now I'm going to pass it to Jacob because I went for the lowest hanging fruit on the Dead Sea Scroll tree, and now our resident archaeologist can actually teach us something maybe.
So the thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is a lot of the discussion on it is kind of uses a concept of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I think is kind of whittled down to a point where we lose parts of our understanding of them. First, I should clarify that the term Dead Sea Scrolls is a media grab term that a lot of things get thrown into. So originally it meant the collection of scrolls from the Essene community at Qumran. But now when you see headlines when they say we discovered new Dead Sea Scrolls, 90% of the time it just means they found new scrolls in the Dead Sea region. And they just know that is like a title that will boost them instantly because it has so much media weight to it at this point. So be careful of that if you see new headlines about that. It often doesn't mean they're part of the collection. It often just means they were found over there. But what the Essene community at Qumran gathered is a collection of religious writings, many of which are specific to their community. So you have like the community rule, which outlines certain rules and ways of living specific to that group that wouldn't have been common in Judaism at the time. But some of the others give sort of a glimpse into basically a world of Jewish scripture that was not standardized. We kind of know about this already. For example, if you look in the Epistle of Jude, there is a reference to the Book of Enoch, which was also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have good evidence that people in Judaism in the Roman Empire often did use that as scripture. There's other works like the Genesis Apocryphon, which takes the Book of Genesis and basically expands the stories outwards. And so I think to get to the ideas of like how I don't know the John Marco Allegro that's being cited here. Maybe I've come across the name and don't remember it. But I would say that the way the Dead Sea Scrolls relate to Christianity and our faith today probably shouldn't be that much as understanding the religious atmosphere of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds they date to, and specifically Judaism in that time. And it should help us realize that ancient canons of the Bible were not closed. They were a discussion between different groups of people who had different ideas on what constituted sacred scripture. And that was going on in the time of the New Testament still. And the Qumran community is just a great example of one manifestation of that conversation.
All right, thank you. So I want to give Sarah, and I'm just going to call you A up, an opportunity to say hi and pose a question or add something in conversation.
Hi, I'm just curious, what do people think about Noah's Ark staying at finishing at Mount Ararat? I don't know the historical or how that sits in terms of proof of that happening.
Jacob, is that a you question?
It might be. So I grew up a young Earth creationist. I will say I had a history with that. But to put a long story short, the further you dig into trying to demonstrate a literal historical Great Flood, you will find that it's very, very historically and scientifically an uphill battle. We don't have evidence of like a worldwide deluge in the fossil record. We don't really have a way to explain how all of the animals were released in one part of the earth and spread out to different populations in different parts of the earth. We don't have a way to explain how there are still freshwater fish with the Great Flood. So, like at the end of the day, archaeologically, geologically, etc., you won't find anyone in those communities really that holds the idea of a literal Great Flood. What you will find, however, is a discussion of what the story means, and in a lot of ways, it does relate to like the concerns of living in a river valley when floods would often be in places like Mesopotamia.
You live and die by the waterfall.
Yeah. And so if you think about it this way, where you think about how you illustrate that God protects those who are faithful and will act with vengeance at times upon the wicked. It is sort of the ultimate expression of doing that. And there are Noah's flood story. If you ever get a chance to read the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis narrative in Mesopotamian literature, you'll find that the Genesis flood story like very directly lifts tropes from there, but then puts basically a Hebrew spin on top of it, a monotheistic spin on top of it. And so you can think of it as basically like using a story that people probably were familiar with.
It was seizing on a pre-existing consensus that because people were familiar with a flood narrative, it was an opportunity to riff off that, like you might riff off a meme, perhaps, to send your own message. Yes, no? Was I close?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Did I pass? Am I expelled? What happened?
It sounds like a meme again.
Exactly, I suppose.
In the community I grew up in, it was very popular to ponder the possibility that Noah's flood was historically actually the event of the Mediterranean and or Black Sea filling in when the Rock of Gibraltar broke. Is there any archaeological credence to an idea like that?
So it tends to be the Black Sea story is popular online, but sort of like the Santorini Atlantis story, it doesn't have a lot to go on. It's tempting to look for historical events to mean one specific, or rather to have these narratives center around one historical event. But often we're talking about differences upon thousands of years that you have to have the story maintain in the historical record. Like the Black Sea flood, we're talking about the extended consequences of the end of the Ice Age. Like it's not temporally close to the civilizations writing about these flood myths at all. That's not to say the oral record can't carry these things, but it's incredibly hard to evidence. It's basically a big blank area to look at. So I tend to think that the more plausible idea is just that, like, cultures have anxieties and they have things that are worrisome to them. And if you're living in a river valley like the peoples of Mesopotamia did, and like the Hebrews did when they were in exile, you end up with this situation where that is going to be the large cultural anxiety that's kind of looming, which is that the river gets too high, or in the worst case, I suppose, the whole world gets flooded.
So I want to say something about the world flooding. I think that there's a little bit of like when we say a worldwide flood today, we think of the blue sphere that is the Earth, all blue, no green, no ground, no nothing, all blue. And I think that at the time, for a lot of people, when you heard worldwide flood, the world was as far as you had seen or heard of, which for some people was not very large. So, I think the idea of a global flood is a very us thought, and the idea of the world back then would be closer to, my world, perhaps.
Yeah, and even like the kings of Babylon and Assyria, for instance, would describe themselves as rulers of the four corners of the earth. And obviously, if you went to the edges of their empire, there was land beyond that. But like, it's a way of talking about vast territories. So I think there's something to what you're saying there, in that like the world is definitely conceptualized a lot different.
Did I give the Lone Ripper and Up an opportunity to talk?
Yeah, that was my question, but you answered it really good.
Okay, thanks.
I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. It was much appreciated.
Thanks for the question. The Lone Ripper, you want to introduce yourself, throw out a question, or add to the conversation?
Sure, I'll introduce myself. I've pretty much grown up a Christian my entire life, went to a Christian high school, and the weirdest thing for me, this is going back to the decline of the church conversation you guys were having earlier, was that like you'd get all like most of my like a lot of my classmates, they'd say they were Christian, they go to a Christian school, and to get in like you needed like a letter of recommendation from a pastor. And then just like the way they acted just completely like just didn't go with what the Bible was teaching. And I was so confused on like why it was happening. And then so
did they get it?
That's just my 2 cents on like what's happening with like the whole decline of the church, is that like like kids aren't really taking faith seriously. Whereas
I think that we run into a problem when we find ourselves, and this is something I see a lot on Dank Christian memes, saying, well, if you're not being a Christian my way, you're not being a Christian. And I think it's important to remember that there's a whole body of Christ, and that the hand shouldn't think it's better than the foot, even though the foot is always dirty and the hand is super useful. That we need to be more merciful when we look at other Christians and recognize that we come from different traditions. Doesn't make that tradition wrong, or their tradition wrong, or your tradition wrong. But if we are just going to completely discount people because they're not meeting our standards, I don't know that that's really the best way for Christians to like I said, be the body of Christ and offer the diversity of gifts that comes from something like that.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I'm talking like they're like having like hooking up, having sex before marriage, like smoking, like not acting, not representing Christ. Like I don't like these.
You're going to find
classmates.
that not all Christians find that valuable. There are some Christians out there who say, if I smoke, I'm only hurting myself. And, if I'm being safe and consenting and everything. And, I think that we get hung up on particular sins or what we think are sins from our perspective. And it really obscures our view of a full and complete person because we all got sins. And if we lose track of our sins, then we're just like the person with the plank in their eye trying to help someone with a speck. But I have to admit, I have a plank in my eye because I am not looking at the comments, and I said that I would. And I have said multiple times that I should be chastised if I don't. So I am now pulling up our comments. Hello, I am new here and got told about this through Jacob. Jacob, then why don't you read this one? I should. Yeah, Jacob.
Yeah, sure.
Can you read this one?
Yeah.
You did this.
Yeah. This is my friend who's been DMing me occasionally in the background right now. It says, "Hello, I am new here and got told about this through Jacob. I am not a Christian, but Christianity and other religions are very interesting to me. I am an anarchist, however, and have a great interest in religious anarchism, including Christian anarchism of the sorts of Tolstoy, the Diggers, and the Quakers. I love to, even though they weren't really socialists or anarchists. Now, how likely is it that Jesus would have identified with modern anarchist ideas, or if an anarchist analysis of the historical Jesus is accurate? This is perhaps not so relevant for the rest of your audience, so skip it if you want to, but I really would like to know your opinions on this topic."
I imagine that certain folk would have labeled Jesus an anarchist, as many political groups like to label their opposition as anarchists. But I don't know if that word even existed in that sense back in that time. I wish we had a linguist.
I would say directly, I know I'm not the minister here, I'm sorry, but directly no, because Jesus said that give unto Caesar, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's when he was talking about the coin, which I always saw as kind of, you don't obey Caesar in a non-biblical way, and Caesar is a representation of the government. Excuse me for not elaborating on that, but Caesar was the government in the day, and it's like you should obey the government to. Jesus said, I'm paraphrasing, obey the government to the degree that it is biblical. Is that correct? I'm not 100% on this.
I think that's a fair interpretation of that statement of the biblical Jesus. I also tend to always emphasize the second half of that statement, which is, and give to God what is God's. And since the coin would have had the image of Caesar on it, but our understanding of Genesis would mean that we have the image of God on us, that part is going on as well. So we're also giving to God what is God's. I also think that parable is large about picking your battles, about saying, hey, none of us can solve all the world's problems by making perfect choices all on our own. It's always going to be bigger than us, but we have to try to do something instead of trying to do everything. Jesus is an anarchist? I mean, that's really hard to say because his historical context would have been one of empire and perhaps also fading empire and people wondering what the world would look like without empire. I've never thought about that question before, but it's gotten me thinking.
Jacob, do you want to take a swing at this one?
So I guess I can take this from two angles. The first is like the political world Jesus interacted with was one of empire, but also I think that we have to remember that ancient states were not modern states, and much as we like to look at things like the brutality of the Roman Empire in like putting down Spartacus's rebellion and crucifying everyone on the Appian Way, for most people who lived in the empire, this was not how it interacted with them. There was a small set of the Roman population, well, not small, but a minority set of the Roman population who had citizenship and were essentially on the register of the state. Most people, there were censuses, but most people went about with very little interaction with the state. It was a distant concept. When they point to Caesar on the coin and use him to represent the state, the reason Caesar's face is on the coin is because in this world before mass media, that is how you distribute down the image of the ruler that you want everyone to recognize to the people. And so a lot of the criticisms that anarchism has today towards large government and whatnot, I think would have had to be framed very differently to even apply in that context. And as such, it's hard to take what's said there and map it directly to a modern political context. I think I clarified another angle when I started this monologue, but I think I mixed the two there, so I don't have much more to say on that. But in general, if we apply specific ideological constructs we have today 2,000 years back and try to put them on Jesus, we end up with a problem of just very different circumstances. And so I think at least for me, to move out of the historical part and into the more opinion part, if you want to apply the words of Jesus and don't ask what political ideology he's advocating for, look at the various different things, the various different characteristics of the kingdom of God, and try to seek out what the way to further that in society in your context is.
All right. Was that question from Nun Tribe?
Nope.
All right. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hi. Thank you guys for doing this. My name is Nun Tribe. I run the AV ministry at my church here in Denver, Colorado, predominantly Black church that is Protestant. So that's kind of my background. I don't always necessarily see kind of those voices in the Reddit, but anywho, my question is about the thought process that church is a business. I've heard Christians say, "Oh, church is just a business," or "Church is a business." As a person with an MBA, that always kind of strikes me as odd because the business is really about profit. Certainly, there are some churches that are exploitative in nature and absolutely operate and have a business-minded goal in mind. But I guess my question to those on the panel are, what are your thoughts about that? And kind of even to the earlier comment that was made about churches being more focused on outreach and really demonstrating fruits of the Spirit type behaviors, again, in this question, as opposed to profit.
I tend to push back hard against the idea of church as a business. Increasingly, seminaries are actually teaching classes around small business finance and budgeting and things like that. And I suppose there's a practical reason for that. But I've also been in council meetings where people have said things like, well, we have to run the church like a business. And I don't believe that, because I believe that in a business, you are trying to leverage your product for maximum profit. And I do not believe that that should be how success is measured in the church at all. If anything, the fact that we're collecting money for the church should be seen as a necessary evil, at least I believe, which is ironic for me to say because that money pays my salary. But I do think that church as a business is problematic. It's funny that the sentiment around preachers talking about money in church seems to have changed a lot. It was only about 10 years ago that the message preachers were often getting is, don't talk about money in the pulpit because it makes us look hypocritical and makes us look greedy. It's driving away visitors and young people. But now the messaging that we usually get as preachers is that we don't talk about money enough. And as a result, people are considering their money and their faith values entirely separate and aren't considering their faith values at all when it concerns how they spend their money. So it seems to be this really, really tricky line that we're trying to walk here. And the idea that Church 3.0, where there won't be paid staff or a building solving some of these problems, is also interesting.
I always thought of church or churches as nonprofits, and or not-for-profit organizations. So that, that's a little bit of a difference from what I'm used to. But I think that for me, being a digital minister on the internet and on Reddit of all places, there's quite a bit of skepticism for someone, saying that they're a minister in any way. And, one of the things I can say to sort of legitimize myself is that I'm a volunteer. I'm not paid. No one's giving me any money. Reddit's not paying me. There's no way to profit off Dank Christian memes. And if there was, I wouldn't want to do it. And I think that makes it easier for when we come to Lent and say, hey, if you can give to St. Jude's, now would be a pretty awesome time to do that. That we're not saying give us money. We're saying give them money. And, we set up our own Dank Christian memes themed, fundraiser to have fun with it and everything. But all the money goes directly to St. Jude, and we make that clear. And we watch out for spammers by telling everyone never give money to anyone who is off the St. Jude fundraiser domain or anything like that. Because, this is the internet and scammers are somehow even more present here. So I think that, there is a lot of scrutiny, and, we as a community and I as a digital minister need to really be aware of that. And, I'm thankful that we can be sort of hands off on money. But yeah, when your salary is part of it, that's an important component.
This is actually you might not even remember this, but this is reminding me of a story when we were in SEM, and there was this just crazy winter where it snowed so much, and the school had used up its snow removal budget way
The city of Boston had used their snow removal budget. Yeah, there was no... It was bad.
And the question came up about how they should handle that. And I don't remember exactly how the words went down, but I remember it coming down to this exact paradigm. If the school is a business, they have no right to ask the students to help clear snow because we are the customer. We are the ones who paid to be here. It is your job to offer a product to us. But if the school is a ministry, then why not ask the students to help? Isn't the goal to have a positive experience for everybody? If the school is a ministry and not a business, then it is totally okay for them to come to us and say, look, guys, we're out of money for snow removal. Can you help us out for the good of the experience here?
Yeah, and I think you really put your finger on the conflict there. And I think when it's in a private school seminary scenario, that's different. Whereas I believe my words to the dean were, let me know if you need me to round up students to start shoveling. And, I had a number of able-bodied students in mind because as a seminary, many of our folks were older and probably shouldn't be shoveling, especially not with this level of heft that we were dealing with. But yeah, I think the business model won out and it didn't get shoveled. Yeah, it was not. I mean, it eventually got shoveled. We didn't all just sit and shelter in. I think we, mostly ended up doing a lot of the shoveling, and then there was no removal. I don't know how that happened, though. Yeah. I think someone used a credit card of some form.
Yeah, but the dean and the regents got caught in their business model thinking, which I think was to their detriment in that event.
Yeah. That's definitely. I think that there's a lot of folks out there, at least that we see in Dank Christian memes and on Reddit, that, you know, they're keenly aware of Joel Osteen, and they're going to apply that to organizations and individuals until they see them do otherwise. And thankfully, you know, we do have examples of groups doing otherwise and silly things. I think we had a group of friars that adopted a dog as part of their community last week. So yeah, there's balance, but also Joel Osteen is out there, and I think a lot of folks can see how it doesn't make Christianity look great. But you know, that's me being judgmental now. So, did you have a follow-up? Want to say anything else, Non-Tribe?
I'll say this one quick thing, and thank you. What's interesting to me, and I loved your responses. I think I obviously follow along probably with your beliefs. What's interesting to me, even in the context of it, is how many, to your point, how many churches, again, they're sort of proud of saying that that church is a business. I've heard that several times over the last year, and I'm just like, why would you want to be thought of that way?
I think
to your point
prosperity
earlier,
gospel is real. I think that prosperity gospel has been so effective that you don't need to preach it anymore. I think it's where a lot of people default to, that if we're going to reflect godliness, we have to reflect wealth. If we're going to reflect Christ, we need to reflect Christ's royalty. And a number of different denominations respond to this in a number of different ways. It's messy. Sorry, I interrupted you. You should continue.
Oh, the end part of that and I also agree with the concept, again, as an MBA, and you were talking about the courses that folks are taking in seminary. Of course, you need to know how to, balance the budget at the end of the year and how to get the right prices for things. But yeah, I mean, the education of how to operate, we can think about the parable of the shrewd manager, from Jesus's own mouth. Yeah, absolutely. You should probably know how to handle business. And in fact, the world does a better job of it than Christians in some cases. But the thought process that you sort of set off with that as the goal, I think is problematic. And anywho, I'm glad that this sub exists, and I enjoy it, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's see. What do we have for comments? I'm doing my best. I'm trying to be dutiful on the comments here. Oh, did we ever get to the Vermilion Duke's question that he typed up here about Jacob? I don't think we did.
No, we haven't.
I don't know if I saw that. Let me see. Where is that?
All right, I'll read it, and you guys stop me if we've heard it before.
Okay.
I'll just ask this pretty derailing question, and listen, it's not derailing because I took time for it, so it's all good. Look at me, pat myself on the back. I was reading Genesis 26 through 35 and noticed that Jacob is this horrible person who God keeps blessing. I understand that God is demonstrating his grace and is unearnable, and that it's not by our merit that we are blessed. But why does God never condemn Jacob or tell him to change his character and stop sinning and just keep blessing? I've been trying to wrap my head around this for a few days. Thanks. Gimmicks,
so it's about biblical Jacob, not me.
It's biblical Jacob, not you, Jacob. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to call you out accidentally. I'm not particularly well read on this passage.
I've always read about the different patriarchs and thought I was named after the rudest one. Because when you read the story,
so this is personal for you.
It is. I mean, it doesn't matter. I like the stories, but he's definitely like the troublemaker. He is he who grips the heel, or in like every Bible footnotes, figuratively, he deceives. So I don't know. I'm not equipped to answer this question. I don't think, but it's definitely like been one that's been on my mind in the past too.
So I am a English scholar, and so I am often inclined to interpret characters through archetypes and literary trends and things like that. And so I tend to see Jacob as the trickster. Most most cultures, most societies have a very prominent figure in their folklore, in their mythology, who is a trickster, somebody who tries to get what they want through cleverness instead of through goodwill and good faith. In many ways, that is Jacob's whole MO. He tries to be clever and witty to get what he wants, to take advantage of people, as opposed to dealing with them in good faith. And I think that that is why so much is put on the story of him going back to Esau's land. Because when he goes home, when he goes back to where he grew up, it's the first time in his life that he's going to try vulnerability. It's the first time in his life where he's going to try just putting his heart out there and hope that Esau is going to be a good brother and that love will prevail. That's why I think he has this night where he's all by himself and he wrestles with what could very well be his own conscience, his own soul. I think the story all builds up to that for this very reason, because up to that point in the story, Jacob was always the trickster. He was always the one trying to get what he wants through deception. And now he's going to try and just hope Esau's cool. No, that's not to say he stops being a trickster after that moment, but I do think it's his dark night of the soul, and the story wants us to see that. This guy who's going to try vulnerability for the first time. It's also true that this story takes place in the Bible before all that Moses and the law business. So there is an angle you could take which says that, well, Moses hasn't brought the people the law. They don't have the Ten Commandments yet. So how is Jacob? Jacob doesn't have biblical law the way that people after Moses would. But it's also true, and I think so. Augustine, the North African bishop who is foundational to a lot of Christian theology, he did not grow up a Christian. And one of the reasons he was not a Christian as a young person is because he saw the patriarchs as immoral. He was like, why should we be looking up to these people? They aren't examples of morality. So why should they be the leaders? And what eventually I think made sense to him was someone saying something along the lines of, the Bible is actually more reliable because it doesn't describe the world the way it should be. It describes the world the way it is. And that's why there aren't these perfect paragons of magnanimity in the Bible. The Bible names the flaws of its characters because it's describing the world the way it really is.
I was going to mention the book of Judges that we have. Stop me if I get off base here, but we have a series of sort of problematic, flawed heroes, and I think one way to tying this back to what I was saying before is that these flawed heroes, I think God still saw them as tools to be used for God's own will. And I think where we look at each other and see broken people first, God sees sharpened tools in some ways, and just because we are not perfect doesn't mean that we do not have a value to God or a role to play in God's plan playing out on earth. Do I pass? Do I fail? Oh no, am I expelled again?
Nice work, Broclen.
Sorry, I need your validation. I wither and die with that. We have some folks that I'm trying to invite up. I don't know if they're experiencing a glitch or but we do have one more. We have one more question in our comments. They just realized that this was Dank Christian Memes. I was raised Catholic and lost my faith around 9th grade. I tried once to rekindle, but it did not take. No longer interested in Catholicism, but I consider myself spiritual, and Christianity resonates because of my upbringing. Any advice? Gimmicks, do you want to start it off, or should I start it off?
Can you say the last couple sentences again?
I believe I can. Let me get it back up here. No longer interested in Catholicism. They are no longer interested in Catholicism, but they consider themselves spiritual, and Christianity resonates because of their upbringing. Any advice? Question mark. You hear me?
Yeah.
I think this speaks to something I was saying before, where, some folks are at least temporarily in a sort of post-denominational perspective, and that, they feel like they need to take some steps outside that denomination to sort of be able to grow further or find out what's next for them on their faith journey. And I think that can be really hard. But I also, see that as a valid, that hard things are worth doing. What do you think, Gimmicks?
Yeah, and it sounds to me like this person is in a very honest place. I think they're doing the work, they're doing the soul searching, they're doing the honesty piece, and so I don't think they're necessarily on the wrong course. And so, based on the information that I have, I think I would say keep doing the soul searching, keep doing the honesty piece, and I think you're on a good course.
I often recommend the Gospels if that getting back to Jesus's mission on earth can also often be helpful if you're in a Bible reading position, but also just asking yourself the deeper questions. What is it about my previous faith tradition that isn't working, or that I don't have answers to, or that I'm struggling with? And what is, if there are parts that are important, then that is also valuable, and you may want to hold fast to them depending on what your situation is. All right, took care of that. Yeah, so, obviously I'm coming from Dank Christian memes where, a lot of folks are comparing notes, and plenty of folks are moving between denominational settings and even sometimes moving out of Christianity, either to go somewhere else or to eventually end up coming back to Christianity in some different form. So, to me, this feels almost normal, but I know to be in that position is actually really, really daunting. So forgive me if I'm not being totally fair to that. Jacob, do you have any insight as someone who's moved from one tradition to something else? I'm putting you on the spot now. I've been doing that a lot lately.
I guess for people specifically going through periods of faith transition, I think the best thing to do is to realize that you don't necessarily have to have everything right yet, because we all go through I've had views that have been challenged, and I've felt when they get challenged, it's uncomfortable, right? But eventually, sometimes you realize that you've just not been right all the time, and it's okay to. I don't know how to articulate this exactly, but it's okay to. It's important to realize that we ourselves don't know with absolute certainty sacred truth always. Sometimes we have to be the ones to question ourselves and look for it. And if we don't go through that process sometimes, if our ideas are already lofty and we've put sureness in places that it doesn't always belong, sometimes that means that there will be problems that won't go fixed until we go through that process.
Nun Tribe, I was reading through your comments in the thread. Do you want to speak to them at all in the chat? I don't want to put you on the spot too bad here, but I want to give you an opportunity to share your perspective. It's very well organized.
Are you talking about Jacob?
No, I thought Nun Tribe, you had made a comment here.
I made a couple. Maybe about Gomer. Those are the only two I made.
All right, sorry. Didn't mean to didn't mean to put you on the spot. Too bad. It's just I didn't want you to feel like you couldn't share in the chat.
So kind of on topic, I was raised pretty Christian, and as it is with the young people, almost everyone I know, just as they got older, dropped out of church and weren't really interested. And I am currently, I have spiraled back into spirituality and am now pretty close to Christianity, I think, but a lot of people I talk to tend to treat it like a one or nothing thing, where you either believe everything in Christianity or what the Bible says, or you're just not a true Christian and you should, not.
I think a lot of Christians have been in that position where they feel the need to make a distinction between themselves and the stereotypes that people may have said. And I think that's probably been a problem for a while. But, I think even within Christians, I think we have stereotypes about various faith groups as well. So I think we're always kind of trying to qualify, well, I'm this kind of, I'm a biblical Christian, I'm an evangelical, I'm a non-denominational, that there's all manner of ways of trying to make ourselves separate and distinct. And Gimmicks, do you have a perspective on this one?
Yeah. So I'm very comfortable with the label Christian. Obviously, I'm a Christian minister. I'm very comfortable keep putting that label upon myself, even though I know that there are a lot of people that would tell me that I'm not a Christian. And I'm also very comfortable with that. I'm comfortable claiming that title, even though I know there are people who would tell me that, I don't check the right boxes for that label. One of the things that I think is very neat about what happens on this subreddit is I do think it's one of the very, very few places in this world where people of faith and people of no faith dialogue in good faith. Because
that's a great way of putting it.
Because in the world, a lot of times when religion comes up, people feel put on the spot, they feel defensive, they have to justify, like, okay, you brought up religion, that means now we're debating. And when we get past that, we often find that we have a lot more in common than our various labels would denote. I have certainly talked with people who consider themselves an atheist, but when we really, really get into the weeds, into the details, our faith doesn't look nearly as different as you would expect when one of us labels himself a Christian and the other an atheist. So I don't have a good answer for that. I don't have a good answer for when you kind of get it from both sides, when people are telling you you're not a Christian because you don't believe everything in the Bible, but also people telling you, you don't belong on this side of the street either because you do have this spirituality and these spiritual beliefs. The only real answer, I think, is just to talk to people, but polite society is not conducive to those conversations, which is, again, one of the things that I think makes Dank Christian memes so special is that, we're all just here to support each other and enjoy each other and have a good time.
When I was a younger man, I used to wear a cross necklace, and I eventually found that because I was wearing that cross necklace, rather than saying like, oh, this guy's Christian, obviously wearing a cross, like easy conclusion to come to, that people were actually interested in what kind of Christian I was. Specifically, was I their kind of Christian? Was I saved because I believed what they believed? Was I their friend because we believed the same thing, even though we don't actually know each other? And I realized that this was a litmus test, that I was just being tested, that each Christian of interest would, try to decide if I was their kind, and I presume thereafter try to win me over. So I eventually decided that I should stop wearing the cross because that was not what I wanted and not conversations I wanted to have. And also that if I have to like literally label myself in that way to be Christian, then maybe I'm getting held up in something that isn't important. That, rather than looking at a fashion symbol, which is often made of a precious metal of some kind, that, I should be living a life in a way that, is more indicative of what my faith is and what my values are. So yeah, I've found that to be pretty distracting. And like I said, these Christian folks coming at me, it didn't feel like they were coming at me with good faith. They weren't the kind of conversations I wanted to be having. Well, thank you everyone for sharing. I think that we're going to actually come to the end of our podcast here. We're coming up on the 2.5 hour mark, and I don't want to keep Gimmicks up past his bedtime. But I want to give everyone an opportunity to say their last word. If you have any projects you're working on that you want to plug, now's the time to do that and throw it in comments. Or, just share your final thought. Intikatis, I'm sorry, I never got your name right. Do you want to give your last word first?
Yeah, I would like to. And I really enjoyed the podcast, and it's great that you do this. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining in. Jacob, do you have a final thought? Anything you want to plug today?
I'd just like to thank Gimmicks for being here. He provided a lot of good perspectives and was a great addition to the chat today. Yeah.
Gimmicks, we never answered this question, and I said we would. If I'm a digital minister, what does that make you? A traditional minister, an analog minister, a minister? How do you deal with this question?
Yeah, like brick and mortar, parish. You're right. We talked about this yesterday. And
brick and mortar makes you sound like a stonemason.
Yeah, as if the building of the edifice is the work, is the ministry. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. Maybe another time we'll come up with something better.
Oh, you're suggesting there might be another time you're willing to join us again, perhaps?
I think so, yeah.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Vermilion, we're on our final thoughts here. Do you want to share anything or plug any projects on our way out the door?
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask if you wanted to answer. Oh, you're done now?
We're coming up to the end. I think we answered your question while you were gone. So you may want to go back and listen to the recording. It takes a little while to render the recording, but once it's there,
I didn't know you could listen to this. Okay. Yeah, no, I got nothing.
Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for both talking and participating in comments. Gimmicks, anything you want to plug or share on your way out the door?
I just want to say, Broclen, I think you're really good at this. I think that you've fostered something pretty neat here, and I'm impressed with your leadership of this entirely new medium. So I want to commend you for the work you've done here.
I swear I'm not paying him. I'm not paid by anyone. I didn't bring him on here just to compliment me. But yes, I do think Dank Christian Memes is an awesome community, and I'm glad that we can engage with our community and Reddit overall in a new way. And thanks for being here, Gimmicks, and giving your professional experience to add to our conversation. I'm just going to conclude by saying I am Broclen. I've been your host. I am the digital minister and a moderator for Dank Christian Memes. This has been our podcast. We don't know what we're doing, but we did this. Dank Christian Memes is a place for all sorts of Christians and non-Christians. So if you have an opportunity, come check us out, participate in the comments. And our next little recording is going to be on Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Yes, I remember that. Who says I don't? All right. Now we are going to be played off by our musical stylings by Olive Tiger.